Somewhere in the vast, snow-blanketed nothingness of ancient Siberia, where your snot freezes before it leaves your nose, and the word vacation means relocating your yurt 3 feet to the left, there lived tribes who thought they had life all figured out. They had fire, they had fermented yak milk, they had suspiciously silent shamans, and best of all, they had space. Miles and miles of space, until one day, something very un-Siberian entered their world. Ambition. Specifically, Turkic ambition, and with it came horses, steel, bureaucracy, and very well-dressed men with alarming mustaches. You see, the indigenous Siberian tribes, let's call them the unbothered, were a peaceful people. Not because they were saints, but because it's hard to conquer anyone when you're waist-deep in snow, 9 months of the year, and your sled dogs are unionized. These were folks like the Selkup, the Evenki, and the Nenets. Hunters, reindeer herders, and accidental philosophers who asked deep questions like, "Why does the sun hate us?" or "Did I just marry my cousin again?" Meanwhile, further south, the Turkic peoples were doing that thing powerful civilizations do, getting too big for their yurts. After centuries of stewing in the cauldron of Central Asia, fighting, farming, and inventing disturbingly complex drinking games, the Turkic tribes began spreading out like butter on a hot step. They weren't so much invading as they were expanding forcefully with enthusiasm. And unfortunately for the unbothered, Siberia was north, and north was next. It began innocently enough. A few Turkic scouts riding in like early Amazon delivery guys, offering trade and friendship, and possibly a couple of swords that were definitely not gifts. They smiled, they danced, they maybe married a local or two. And then, suddenly, poof, the friendly visitors brought friends. Lots of friends. With weapons and tax forms. Before anyone could say, "Wait, this isn't a diplomatic mission," the unbothered were being told they were now part of a khaganate. The khaganate of what now? Who knows? The name changed depending on which Turkic noble was shouting loudest that month. Some called it the Göktürk Khaganate, others the Uyghur Khaganate, and one local drunk insisted it was the very big Mustached Club. The point is, the unbothered had been bothered. Now, these weren't your typical conquerors. The Turkic expansion was a complex beast. Some came as warriors, others came as administrators with ledgers and a dangerous amount of interest in census-taking. The more polite ones offered the indigenous people 2 choices: join us, be taxed, and speak our language, or see that forest, go live behind it. Many tribes took the hint. Thus began the Great Yak Exodus, a mass movement of indigenous tribes northward, deeper into the cold arms of Siberia, dragging their reindeer, their children, and their growing list of historical grievances. Picture this: a long line of shaggy yaks, grumbling elders, and angry teenagers muttering things like, "I liked the old tundra better." It was less of a strategic retreat and more of a frostbitten shuffle into obscurity. Of course, not everyone went quietly. Some tribes tried to resist, which in Siberia often meant throwing a snowball and hiding behind a pine tree. Brave, yes. Effective, not even a little. The Turkic warriors, having mastered cavalry combat and the art of shouting dramatically in multiple languages, made quick work of the opposition. But being surprisingly bureaucratic for nomads, they also set up systems of assimilation, intermarriage, forced language adoption, and most horrifying of all, school. Yes, Turkic-run schools, where Evenki kids were taught that yak was spelled with a Q, and everyone was suspiciously named something like Karagul. It was cultural erosion disguised as education, like being brainwashed by a substitute teacher with a sword. Meanwhile, the displaced tribes found themselves squeezed into the northernmost fringes of Siberia. Life became even harsher. No longer could they trade easily with southern neighbors or follow traditional migratory routes. Every step northward was a goodbye to something. Rituals, relationships, and worst of all, fermented fish snacks you could only find near the Ob River. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Indigenous Siberians are nothing if not resilient. They adapted. They developed new survival skills, like snowball sniping and passive-aggressive throat singing. They rebuilt communities with grit and a complete lack of building materials. They even invented dark humor centuries before Russia made it fashionable. The old ways changed, but they didn't disappear. Oral traditions survived, passed down in hushed tones over firelight, often with jokes about how our great-grandfather once chased off a Turk with nothing but a frozen fish. These tales, though colored by exaggeration and selective memory, kept their identity alive. And somewhere between the comedy and the trauma, a new kind of indigenous culture was born, one shaped by loss, yes, but also by defiance. Centuries passed. The Turkic Khaganates rose and fell, splintered and fused, like badly managed rock bands. Some of the very descendants of those conquerors ended up as minorities themselves, displaced in turn by Mongols, Russians, and global capitalism. History, it seems, has a sense of irony. So, what can we take from this frosty slice of history? Maybe it's this, that culture is tougher than conquest, that yak-based societies are underrated, and that somewhere out there, in the Siberian wilderness, a grumpy elder is still telling stories about how, back in my day, we didn't have borders, we had blizzards. If you liked this absurd yet tragically true story, hit that like button. Share it with a friend who thinks history is boring, and leave a comment below. What would you have done if a guy with a horse, a sword, and a census form knocked on your tent? Oh, and next time someone says, Turkic expansion, just nod solemnly and whisper, tell that to the yak. Reveal, here's the twist that most history books skim over. While the displacement of these indigenous Siberian tribes is often painted as a one-way tragedy, there's a bigger picture. Many Turkic groups didn't just conquer, they absorbed. They intermarried, they adopted local customs, and sometimes the locals outlasted them. The line between Turkic and Siberian got blurrier with every snowstorm. Modern genetics and linguistic studies show that some of today's Siberian peoples carry Turkic ancestry, just as Turkic peoples absorbed the spiritual and shamanic traditions of the people they displaced. Culture is a two-way street, even in sub-zero temperatures. So the story of the Turkic expansion into Siberia isn't just about conquest and displacement. It's about the messy, chaotic, occasionally hilarious blending of cultures in one of the world's most unforgiving landscapes. And in the end, no matter who won, the yaks definitely lost.